A cartel convoy crossed into the wrong stretch of desert. The patrolman they thought had retired? He'd been rigging the sand for weeks. When the first SUV hit the tripwire, the sky lit up, and the only thing louder than the flames was the silence that followed. The desert town of Massia Sika existed in the space between forgotten and forsaken. Population 847, if you counted the seasonal ranch hands who drifted through during cattle season. Daniel Rivas had called it home for 3 years now, ever since Martha passed, and the memories in their Phoenix house became too heavy to carry alone. To the locals, he was just another retiree nursing grief with solitude and routine. They'd see him at dawn feeding the strays behind Gonzalez Market, methodically dispensing kibble from a dented metal scoop while speaking softly to the mangy dogs that gathered around his boots. Evenings found him walking the perimeter of his 5-acre spread with a measured pace of a man who had nowhere else to be, sometimes pausing to adjust a fence post or clear debris from his driveway. The widower with kind eyes and steady hands who kept his own counsel, never caused trouble, always paid his bills on time. A good neighbor in the desert way, helpful when needed, invisible when not. They didn't know about the muscle memory that guided his morning runs along the same route every day, the tactical breathing patterns drilled into him during 23 years with U.S. Border Patrol. They couldn't see how his seemingly casual property modifications followed textbook military doctrine. Overlapping fields of fire calculated to the meter, natural choke points enhanced with strategic rock placement, concealed sight lines extending 800 meters across the hardpan toward the Mexican border. Most importantly, they had no idea about the 3 classified years he'd spent as a special tactics liaison embedded with SEAL Team 7 during joint cartel interdiction operations deep in Sonora province. The kind of black ops work that left men with particular skill, specific knowledge, and sleep that came harder with each passing year. But Daniel knew the signs accumulating like storm clouds on a clear horizon. He'd been watching them for weeks now, cataloging each incident with the methodical precision of a trained intelligence analyst. First came the drones, commercial quadcopters probing the area after midnight, their faint whirring barely audible above the constant desert wind. Always the same flight pattern, north-south sweeps at 300 feet, careful to avoid the Border Patrol sensor arrays but mapping everything else with high-resolution cameras. Professional reconnaissance, not teenage mischief. Then the intimidation escalated. Burned barns on 3 different properties, always belonging to families who couldn't afford insurance or rebuilding costs. The fires were too clean, too complete, accelerant patterns that spoke of experience and planning. Within days, each burned property received cash offers from shell companies with Chihuahua addresses. Offers that were accepted without negotiation. Finally came the territorial markers. Red handprints spray-painted on fence posts and mailboxes throughout the valley, appearing overnight like some ancient curse. The locals whispered about gang symbols, but Daniel recognized the signature immediately. Los Hermanos Rojos, the Red Brothers. A trafficking organization that had evolved from smuggling cocaine in the 1990s to moving everything that generated profit. Drugs, weapons, people, stolen vehicles, even black market organs. Their expansion north of the border had been methodical, violent, and largely unopposed by overwhelmed local law enforcement. They followed a proven pattern: reconnaissance, intimidation, acquisition, consolidation. Buy out the willing, burn out the stubborn, and eliminate anyone who posed a genuine threat to operations. Daniel studied the progression from his kitchen window each evening, plotting GPS coordinates on a hand-drawn topographical map. The red marks were getting closer with mathematical precision. 2 miles last month when they hit the Sandoval Ranch. Half a mile last week at the abandoned gas station. Yesterday they'd marked the mailbox at the Martinez place just across the valley from his own property line. They were coming for Massia Sika. And when they arrived, they'd discover that this particular piece of desert came with complications they hadn't anticipated. He opened the gun safe in his bedroom closet, inventorying the contents with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd spent decades preparing for undefined threats. The Remington 700 with Leopold glass zeroed at 600 meters. The suppressed 416 Hong Kong dollars that officially didn't exist in any government database. Enough ammunition to supply a rifle squad for extended operations. All legal, all properly documented, all perfectly ordinary for a retired federal agent with appropriate security clearances. Perfectly ordinary except for the sealed aluminum case hidden beneath the loose floorboards under his bed. Daniel traced the concealed outline with his boot, feeling the solid weight of contents that represented capabilities most civilians couldn't imagine. But he didn't open it yet. Some tools were meant for specific jobs, and this particular job required the right provocation, the proper legal justification, and perfect tactical timing. He didn't have to wait long for any of those elements to align. Outside his window, the desert stretched toward Mexico under a canopy of stars that had witnessed 10,000 years of territorial conflicts. The land itself was neutral, indifferent to human ambitions. But the men who claimed it were not, and tomorrow would bring the next move in a game that Daniel understood better than his opponents realized. He made coffee and settled into his kitchen chair, studying the map by lamplight. Wind patterns, elevation changes, natural cover, approach routes, escape vectors. All the variables that would matter when mathematics and violence intersected in the space between his front gate and the Mexican border. The desert was patient. So was Daniel. But patience, like ammunition, was a finite resource that had to be expended at exactly the right moment for maximum effect. The scouts arrived on Tuesday morning at 0847 hours, driving a dust-covered Silverado with Chihuahua plates and windows tinted dark enough to violate federal transportation regulations. Daniel noted these details automatically, while pouring his second cup of coffee, the same observational discipline that had kept him alive during border interdiction operations. Two men stepped out with the casual arrogance of wolves entering sheep territory. Mid-20s faces weathered by desert sun and marked with Cartel ink. The driver wore a Saints jersey and gold chains that caught the morning light. His passenger was leaner, hungrier, with the predatory stillness of someone accustomed to violence as a business tool. Daniel met them at his front gate, hands empty but positioned for immediate weapon access. 23 years of federal law enforcement had taught him to read body language like a second language, and these men radiated the particular confidence of people who'd never encountered serious resistance. "Morning, gentlemen. Help you with something?" The driver smiled, gold teeth glinting. "Just admiring your property, abuelo. Nice and quiet out here. Peaceful, you know. Man could live out his retirement without any complications." "That's the idea," Daniel replied, noting how the passenger's eyes catalogued his house, his vehicle positions, his sightlines. Professional assessment disguised as casual observation. "Must get lonely though. Old man all by himself, no family around." The passenger spoke for the first time, his accent pure Sinaloa. "Sometimes lonely people make bad decisions. Get themselves hurt when they don't understand how things work." Daniel's expression never changed. "Sometimes they do." The driver produced a can of Krylon spray paint from his jacket pocket, shaking it with theatrical emphasis. "See, we're helping the community understand some things about the new reality. New management coming to this area. People need to know who's in charge now, who they answer to. Saves confusion later." He moved toward the mailbox with deliberate swagger. Daniel shifted his weight slightly, improving his angle of attack, while maintaining the appearance of casual conversation. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." "You wouldn't what, viejo? Paint my own territory? Touch my mailbox? Or anything else on my property?" The scouts exchanged glances, then laughed with genuine amusement. The idea of resistance from a lone retiree was apparently hilarious. The driver sprayed a perfect red handprint on Daniel's mailbox, anyway, the paint still wet and glistening when he stepped back to admire his work. "There. Now everyone knows the situation. This place belongs to Los Hermanos Rojos now. You got 72 hours to pack up your shit and move along, abuelo. Find somewhere else to play cowboy." His voice hardened. "After that, well, accidents happen to stubborn old men who don't listen to good advice." They climbed back into the Silverado, tires spinning in the gravel as they accelerated away. Daniel watched until the dust cloud disappeared behind the mesa, memorizing the license plate and noting the direction of travel. Intelligence gathering was automatic, instinctive, probably pointless. But habits learned in life-or-death situations died hard. He stared at the red handprint for exactly 60 seconds, calculating response options and their likely consequences. Then he walked back to the house and opened the floorboards. The sealed case had been waiting for 3 years, hidden beneath his bedroom like a promise he'd hoped never to keep. Inside, wrapped in military-grade moisture barriers, lay the tools of a trade he'd officially retired from. Level IIA body armor in desert tan, night vision monocular with infrared capability, encrypted radio program with federal emergency frequencies, and det cord measured in lengths that corresponded to specific tactical applications. At the bottom, individually wrapped and labeled with technical specifications, were 8 blocks of C4 plastic explosive. Enough to level a city block or reshape a desert landscape depending on placement and timing. All legally acquired through federal surplus programs, all properly stored according to ATF regulations, all completely invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. Daniel laid everything out on his kitchen table like a surgeon preparing instruments for a complex operation, each item selected for its role in the tactical problem he was solving. Variables and constants, action and reaction, cause and inevitable effect. The next morning, Ranger didn't meet him at the back door. Daniel found his old German shepherd beneath the mesquite tree body, rigid with muscle spasms, foam drying around his muzzle. Strychnine poisoning. A calling card as old as the desert itself and twice as ugly. The dog's eyes were still open, fixed on some distant point beyond pain and confusion. He buried Ranger behind the shed without ceremony, digging through hardpan and caliche with methodical precision. No tears, no words, just the mechanical actions of a man who understood that emotion was a luxury he couldn't afford until the tactical situation was resolved. The grave marker was a simple stone painted with Ranger's name and the dates that mattered. 12 years of loyalty ended by cowards who poisoned dogs to make points about power and territory. Inside the house, Daniel spent the afternoon rigging his property for war. The work required crawling through brush and digging in hardpan that fought every shovel thrust, but his body remembered the rhythm from SEER training and special operations preparation. Pain was temporary, preparation was permanent, and muscle memory was the difference between surviving contact and becoming a casualty statistic. Pressure plates went into the main wash where vehicles would naturally funnel, connected to buried charges by copper wire that couldn't be detected or jammed. Tripwires stretched between mesquite bushes at ankle height linked to flares and noisemakers that would destroy night vision and communications simultaneously. The fuel barrels were positioned with mathematical precision at tactical intervals, each one connected to the others by det cord buried exactly 3 inches underground. Solar batteries provided power for the firing circuits charged during the day and capable of operating for 72 hours without sunlight. By sunset, his 5 acres had transformed from a retirement homestead into something else entirely. Not a home anymore, but a killing field disguised as one where every approach route channeled attackers into predetermined zones of engagement. Daniel climbed to the elevated ridge behind his house and conducted a final reconnaissance through military binoculars. 800 meters of clear sightlines in 3 directions, multiple egress routes mapped, and rehearsed high ground advantage with natural cover provided by wind-carved rock formations. The tactical assessment was mathematically obvious. Anyone coming for him would be entering a pre-planned battlefield where he controlled timing, terrain, and rules of engagement. They would have superior numbers and firepower, but he would have preparation knowledge and the psychological advantage of fighting on home ground for reasons that mattered. Daniel keyed his encrypted radio and ran a systems check confirming all frequencies were clear and all triggers were properly armed. The communication protocols were second-nature muscle memory from operations where radio discipline meant the difference between extraction and unmarked graves in foreign soil. Everything was ready. All contingencies were covered. Now came the hardest part of any military operation: the wait. They want this land hot, he thought, watching the sun disappear behind distant mountains while coyotes began their evening chorus. Fine. Let's light it up. At 0200 hours, the perimeter sensors triggered with a soft chime that meant business had arrived. Daniel's eyes snapped open. 23 years of federal law enforcement pulling him from sleep to full combat alertness in under 3 seconds. The encrypted radio in his earpiece delivered the information his subconscious had been monitoring. Multiple vehicles approaching from the south, moving without headlights across the desert hardpan in tactical formation. He rolled from bed, already dressed in the clothes he'd been sleeping in for 3 nights. Desert camouflage pants, moisture-wicking shirt, boots that could transition from stealth to speed without adjustment. The level IA vest slipped over his head with practiced ease, ceramic plates settling into position like familiar weight. The 416 Hong Kong dollars came off its wall mount loaded with subsonic 5.56 NATO rounds, 30 rounds of precisely manufactured lethality designed for noise discipline and maximum terminal ballistics. The suppressor threaded on with metallic precision, transforming the rifle from loud announcement to whispered conversation. Through the night vision monocular, Daniel counted 5 vehicles maintaining perfect spacing and approach angles. Chevrolet Suburbans, black paint dulled with desert dust to minimize reflection. Professional movement patterns, good communications discipline, no amateur mistakes that suggested panic or inexperience. Los Hermanos Rojos had sent their team for this operation. That meant Daniel was facing military-trained operators with combat experience, proper equipment, and tactical knowledge that matched his own. The game had suddenly become much more interesting. He moved to his preset position on the ridge through routes he'd memorized during 3 weeks of preparation, belly-crawling the final 50 meters to avoid silhouetting against the starfield. Below him, the assault team deployed with textbook precision that confirmed his assessment of their capabilities. 12 men total, armed with AIK pattern rifles and wearing basic body armor that suggested they understood the difference between intimidation and warfare. They moved to disable his security cameras first, a logical step that demonstrated tactical thinking but wouldn't save them from what was coming. The cameras were decoys, visible targets designed to make the attackers feel smart while missing the real sensors. Buried pressure plates and infrared detectors connected to his firing circuits by copper wire that couldn't be hacked, jammed, or detected without specialized equipment they didn't possess. Daniel watched them advance into the main wash, following the natural terrain features that funneled them exactly where 3 weeks of preparation had predicted they would go. The team leader raised his hand in a standard military signal indicating final approach phase. Daniel pressed the first detonator. The explosion transformed night into day across 3 acres of desert. 2 50-gallon fuel barrels connected by det cord erupted simultaneously, creating a fireball that rose 30 feet into the air and sent superheated shrapnel in precisely calculated directions. The concussion rolled across the hardpan like thunder from an angry god, echoing off distant mesas and destroying the night vision of anyone within 200 meters. When the flames cleared, 3 cartel soldiers lay motionless in the wash, their tactical formation reduced to scattered bodies and abandoned weapons. The survivors scrambled for cover among the rocks, shouting coordination attempts in rapid Spanish, while their carefully planned assault dissolved into chaos and confusion. Daniel's rifle coughed twice through the suppressor muzzle, flash invisible, thanks to the suppressor's design. Center mass shots at 400 meters targeting the brightest muzzle flashes where panicked shooters were revealing their positions with automatic fire. 2 more bodies dropped before the return fire found his general area. AK rounds cracked overhead close enough to scatter rock fragments from the ridge, but wide enough to confirm that his opponents were shooting at shadows and muzzle flash, rather than identified targets. Daniel rolled left to his secondary position, already knowing where each surviving shooter would be based on their training limitations and terrain constraints. His encrypted radio crackled with intercepted communications. The team leader was calling for backup on frequency 462.725 MHz using simple voice codes that suggested field-expedient communications rather than sophisticated encryption. Professional enough to maintain radio discipline, amateur enough to use predictable frequencies. Daniel switched to the same frequency and mimicked the Sinaloa accent he'd learned during 3 years of cartel operations. Voice alteration was a perishable skill, but muscle memory retained enough to pass casual authentication. Control, this is ground team. Contact negative. False alarm from motion sensors. Recommend holding backup element in reserve until we complete area reconnaissance. Copy, ground team. Standing by for your signal. The surviving cartel soldiers advanced more cautiously now, but their movement patterns revealed they believed reinforcements were still available. Daniel triggered the second set of charges, timing the detonation for maximum psychological impact. Flares erupted from concealed positions throughout the engagement area, flooding the desert with harsh white phosphorus light that destroyed natural night vision and created multiple false targets. In the confusion that followed, Daniel moved to his tertiary position on the eastern slope where his final surprise was waiting. The wash below him was lined with buried irrigation tubing he'd installed over the past month, filled with gasoline and connected to a manual firing system that couldn't be detected or disabled remotely. When the backup convoy arrived, and they would arrive despite his radio deception buying temporary delay, they'd drive straight into a controlled inferno. Daniel settled into his sniper's nest, a natural depression between wind-carved boulders that provided concealment and multiple egress routes. Through his rifle scope he could see vehicle lights approaching from the south, moving fast across the hardpan with tactical lights blazing. The second wave was incoming right on schedule. The desert was about to burn hotter than anyone had planned. The second wave hit the engagement area at 0247 hours, 3 more Suburbans moving fast across the hardpan with tactical lights blazing and radios crackling with urgent Spanish. They'd obviously lost contact with the ground team and were coming in hard, abandoning stealth for speed and firepower. Daniel tracked them through his rifle scope, calculating angles and timing with the cold precision of mathematics applied to violence. The lead vehicle would trigger the fuel line system in approximately 90 seconds. Behind him, scattered among the rocks and shadows, the surviving members of the first assault team were still trading sporadic fire with perceived threats, their night vision shattered and their coordination broken. He keyed his radio one final time, maintaining the accent and calm tone that had worked before. Control, ground team. All clear. Recommend immediate extract to secondary rally point. But this time a different voice answered. Older, more experienced, with the flat authority of someone accustomed to command in tactical situations. Ground team control. That's not Vasquez on the radio. Who the fuck is this? Daniel smiled grimly and switched off the radio, tossing the device aside. The backup team's commander was experienced enough to recognize voice inconsistencies and smart enough to act on suspicious communications. It wouldn't matter now. The tactical timeline had already passed the point where radio games could influence the outcome. The lead Suburban hit the buried pressure trigger at exactly 0248 hours. Fire erupted from the desert floor in a perfect line extending 30 meters across the wash, 3 meters high and fed by 200 gallons of gasoline under controlled pressure. The wall of superheated flame turned night into day, creating thermal currents that sent the lead vehicle spinning sideways off the hardpan and into a cluster of barrel cacti. The second and third Suburban swerved desperately, their drivers blinded by the sudden conflagration and the superheated air that distorted vision and played havoc with depth perception. One vehicle rolled completely over, spilling armed men across the rocky ground. The other managed to maintain control, but drove directly into Daniel's secondary kill zone. He triggered the backup charges with methodical precision. More fuel barrels detonated in carefully timed sequence, creating overlapping fields of fire that transformed the natural approach route into a vision of mechanized hell. Black smoke rolled across the hardpan, carrying the stench of burning gasoline, melting rubber, and the unmistakable odor of superheated metal and worse things. Through his scope, Daniel watched figures bail out of the burning vehicles. Some on fire and rolling desperately in the dirt, some shooting blindly into the smoke and flames, all of them caught in a kill zone he designed specifically for this moment over 3 weeks of methodical preparation. The 416 Hong Kong dollars spoke with measured rhythm. Center mass shots at known distances, each trigger pull backed by decades of training and 3 years of special operations experience in similar terrain. When his 30-round magazine ran dry, Daniel reloaded with the smooth efficiency of muscle memory developed through thousands of repetitions. A muzzle flash sparked from the rocks 40 meters to his left. Close enough to be dangerous, precisely positioned to suggest military training rather than criminal opportunism. The round cracked past his right ear, followed immediately by the thunder of an unsuppressed rifle firing high-velocity ammunition. Daniel rolled behind cover as more shots chewed rock fragments from his position, the impacts telling him that someone had successfully flanked his primary position during the chaos of the fuel line ambush. This was a professional move that suggested genuine military experience rather than cartel training. Someone who understood terrain timing and the psychology of sniper engagement. Someone who represented a significant escalation in the tactical problem Daniel was solving. He belly-crawled backward from his position using the ridgeline for concealment while mentally cataloging everything he knew about the shooter's capabilities. Unsuppressed rifle suggested confidence in firepower over stealth. High-velocity rounds meant serious range capability. Most importantly, the flanking movement demonstrated tactical patience and terrain analysis that elevated this engagement beyond routine cartel violence. The next shot came from a different position, confirming Daniel's assessment. The sniper was moving systematically, trying to triangulate his location through muzzle flash analysis and return fire patterns. Professional tactics probably learned in military service before transitioning to cartel employment. Daniel had encountered this type before during border operations. Former Mexican Army Special Forces who'd crossed over to criminal organizations for better pay and fewer restrictions. They brought genuine military skills to cartel operations, making them exponentially more dangerous than typical criminal shooters. But Daniel had learned something during 3 years with SEAL Team 7 that most people never understood. The key to winning sniper duels wasn't superior marksmanship or better equipment. It was superior patience combined with intimate knowledge of terrain and the psychological discipline to become part of the landscape itself. He settled into a natural depression between two wind-carved boulders, controlling his breathing and heart rate while becoming perfectly motionless. Around him, the fires continued to burn, casting dancing shadows across the desert floor and creating thermal distortions that would complicate optical targeting. Minutes passed with agonizing slowness. Somewhere in the smoke and flame, the surviving cartel soldiers were either dead, dying, or attempting to extract from an engagement that had gone catastrophically wrong. But this sniper was still hunting, still dangerous, still representing a threat that had to be neutralized before Daniel could consider the tactical situation resolved. Movement caught his peripheral vision. A shape shifting behind a mesquite bush 60 meters downslope, barely visible, but different enough from natural vegetation to register as human presence. Professional camouflage and movement discipline, but not quite perfect enough to defeat observation skills honed by decades of tracking human targets across similar terrain. Daniel's crosshairs settled center, mass compensation for wind and elevation difference calculated automatically through training that had become neural pathway rather than conscious thought. The 416 Hong Kong dollars coughed once the suppressed round, traveling at 2,800 feet per second across desert air that carried sound and heat in predictable patterns. The shape jerked backward and fell, rifle clattering across the rocks in the distinctive sound of metal on stone. Daniel kept his scope trained on the position for 60 seconds, watching for secondary movement or signs of life. Nothing moved except smoke and flame from the burning vehicles. He keyed his backup radio and switched to DEA emergency frequency 166.4625 MHz using protocols that would identify him immediately to federal monitoring stations. This is retired Border Patrol Agent Daniel Rivas, Federal ID number 7742 Delta. I have GPS coordinates for active cartel base of operations and request immediate air support for tactical situation in progress. The response came within 4 minutes, confirming that federal agencies maintained monitoring capabilities in the border region. Agent Rivas, this is DEA Air Wing. Copy your transmission and verify your federal identification. Stand by for helicopter support ETA 12 minutes. Daniel smiled as he heard the distant sound of rotors approaching from the north. He'd been tracking Los Hermanos Rojos local operations for 3 months, mapping their supply routes, safe houses, and command structure through careful observation and intelligence analysis. Tonight's assault had provided the final piece of information he'd needed: confirmation of their main base location and the legal justification for sharing that intelligence with federal authorities. Below him in the wash, a figure stumbled out of the smoke with hands raised and rifle abandoned. Obviously wounded, but still mobile, probably the team leader who'd been smart enough to recognize the radio deception and experienced enough to survive the engagement. Daniel descended from his sniper's nest, keeping the wounded man covered while scanning for additional threats. Blood soaked the cartel soldier's left shoulder and his face was pale with shock, but his eyes remained alert and focused. Professional assessment, even in defeat. You speak English? Daniel asked rifle-trained center mass. The man nodded slowly. Yeah, I speak English. You military? Was. You? Mexican Army 1st Special Forces Battalion. Before I got smart about money. He grimaced and pressed his good hand against the shoulder wound. That was some serious shit you just pulled, hermano. Professional grade. Daniel zip-tied the man's hands with tactical restraints tight enough to prevent escape, but not tight enough to cut off circulation. Here's what you're going to tell your bosses when you get back to Chihuahua. This town is off limits now. The old man you thought was harmless? He's got friends in high places and a very particular set of skills developed over 23 years of federal service. You spread the word, Messiah Sika fights back now. He pointed toward the road with his rifle barrel. There's a first aid kit in the red toolbox by my mailbox. Patch yourself up and start walking south. When the DEA finishes raiding your base tonight, you'll want to be far away from here. The wounded soldier studied Daniel's face for a long moment. Professional soldier assessing another professional soldier. This isn't over, hermano. Los hermanos rojos don't forget. Neither do I, Daniel replied. That's why I'm giving you this chance to walk away. Next time there won't be any survivors to carry messages. The cartel soldier stumbled away into the darkness, leaving Daniel alone with a burning desert and the approaching sound of federal helicopters. Justice had a way of finding its own level in the desert, especially when properly motivated and professionally applied. Dawn broke over a landscape transformed by fire and violence. Black smoke still rose from the skeletal remains of 5 Suburbans, their twisted metal cooling in the morning air like prehistoric monuments to tactical miscalculation. Scattered equipment and weapons marked the positions where Los Hermanos Rojos had made their final stand against an opponent they'd fundamentally misunderstood. Sheriff Tom Valdez arrived at 0630 hours, his patrol unit followed by a convoy of crime scene investigators, federal agents, and military specialists, whose presence suggested that last night's engagement had attracted attention at levels far above local law enforcement. He stood at Daniel's gate for several minutes, studying the tactical devastation with the practiced eye of a 20-year veteran who'd seen his share of violence, but nothing quite like this. Sweet Jesus, Daniel. This wasn't just self-defense. This was a military operation. Daniel poured coffee from a battered thermos, offering a cup to the sheriff, while maintaining the calm demeanor of a man whose conscience was clear. His hands were steady, his voice controlled, his bearing that of someone who'd done exactly what circumstances required. They came onto my property with intent to commit violence against me and my community. I defended myself using legal means and appropriate force. With military-grade explosives, precision marksmanship, and tactical preparation that would impress a Marine Corps colonel? Valdez accepted the coffee, but his expression remained skeptical. The DEA is calling this the most successful cartel interdiction operation in New Mexico history. 12 confirmed dead, 1 wounded, and captured, plus intelligence that led them straight to the main base operation in Chihuahua. They're talking about commendations and federal recognition. Sometimes things work out better than expected. Sometimes. Valdez studied Daniel's face, looking for cracks in the composed facade that might reveal the psychological cost of what had happened here. You know they'll investigate every aspect of this. Federal Shooting Review Board property damage assessment questions about how a retired Border Patrol agent happened to have enough C4 and det cord to level a city block hidden under his bedroom floor. Daniel met his gaze with the steady confidence of someone whose paperwork was in perfect order. I have federal permits for everything they'll find. My military service record and law enforcement background will explain the tactical capabilities. As for the specific methods, he shrugged. I read a lot of military history books. Amazing what you can learn from studying successful operations. The sheriff almost smiled despite the carnage surrounding them. Books. Right. Military history. Overhead DEA helicopters continued their systematic patrol of the area, their cameras documenting everything for official reports that would eventually reach Washington. By noon the story would be spreading through law enforcement networks across the Southwest. The cartel assault on Messiah Sika that ended in complete tactical defeat, planned and executed by a single retired federal agent defending his adopted home. But the more important story would travel through different channels entirely. Whispered conversations in cantinas across Chihuahua and Sinaloa. Encrypted radio chatter warning cartel cells about the gringo who turned peaceful desert into a killing field. Most importantly, the message that the wounded survivor would carry back to Los Hermanos Rojos leadership. Some targets weren't worth the cost, and some pieces of territory came with complications that exceeded profit margins. Daniel walked his property line as the federal investigators finished their preliminary documentation. The physical damage was extensive, but reparable with time and money. Scorched earth would heal with the next rainy season. Burned structures could be rebuilt stronger than before. The important thing was the precedent that had been established, the clear demonstration that Messiah Sika was not defenseless territory available for easy conquest. Near the shed where he'd buried Ranger 3 days ago, Daniel discovered an unexpected visitor. A young coyote, probably driven from its den by the explosions and gunfire, watched him from the shade of a Palo Verde tree. The animal maintained a careful distance but didn't flee when Daniel approached, suggesting intelligence and adaptability that might serve it well in this harsh environment. "You look like you could use a reliable home," Daniel said quietly, noting the coyote's lean but healthy appearance. "This place is safe now. Safer than it was yesterday, anyway." Might stay that way if the right lessons were learned. He walked back toward the house, the coyote following at a respectful distance that suggested cautious interest in the arrangement. On his front porch, Daniel retrieved the American flag he'd carefully removed before the assault, folding it according to military protocol and storing it safely away from the coming violence. The flagpole was scorched but still standing, anchored in concrete and desert stone with the engineering precision that characterized everything Daniel built to last. The flag snapped crisp and clean in the morning breeze, visible for miles across the hardpan and mesas that stretched toward Mexico. A declaration that this particular piece of America remained under its original management, defended by citizens who understood the difference between peace and pacification. The desert had always belonged to those strong enough to hold it, smart enough to defend it, and committed enough to pay the price that territorial integrity demanded. Daniel stood beneath the flag for several long minutes, remembering Martha's voice on quiet mornings like this one, when the world seemed balanced and possibility stretched to every horizon. She would have understood what happened here, would have approved of the precision, the restraint, and the calculated response to calculated aggression. Most importantly, she would have recognized that some stands had to be taken regardless of personal cost. His radio crackled with morning traffic. Federal agents coordinating evidence collection, helicopter pilots reporting clear airspace, DEA commanders debriefing successful raids that had netted weapons, drugs, and intelligence worth millions of dollars. The professional chatter of justice being served with compound interest. Daniel switched off the radio and walked inside to begin the practical work of restoration. There were repairs to plan, defensive improvements to design, and preparations to make for whatever challenges might emerge as word of last night's engagement spread through criminal networks on both sides of the border. Los Hermanos Rojos would think long and hard before targeting Messias Seeker again, but other organizations might test the waters to see if the gringo's success had been luck or skill. Territory had to be defended continuously, not just once, and Daniel understood that last night's victory was only the opening move in a longer game. Let them come. The desert was patient, and so was he. Some lessons needed to be taught more than once before they became permanent parts of organizational memory. They wanted to own the desert, Daniel thought, watching the sun climb toward its merciless noon position, while federal helicopters continued their patrol overhead. I just gave it back to the fire where it belongs. The war for Messias Seeker was over. The peace would be harder to maintain, requiring constant vigilance and occasional reminders about the true cost of challenging prepared defenders on their chosen ground. But that was tomorrow's problem. Today the desert belonged to those who understood its rules and possessed the will to enforce them when enforcement became necessary. Daniel poured himself another cup of coffee and began planning improvements.